In Kansas alone, in 1934, farmers harvested more than 350,000 tons of a plant nobody had planted, because it was the only thing still growing in the fields when everything else died from the drought. Between the late 1920s and the 1930s, when drought, dust, and the stock market crash wiped out entire harvests across the United States, farm workers didn't stop eating. They just stopped waiting for the crop to fix it on its own. Here are 10 real field snacks and meals that kept farm families alive when the harvest simply didn't come in. Before we go on, subscribe now. Item 10 on this list is the most surprising one in the entire video, and you don't want to find out without already following the channel. Tumbleweed shoots, Russian thistle. When an entire crop dried up and died in the ground, one plant kept sprouting between the furrows anyway. The tumbleweed, or Russian thistle, an invasive species Kansas farmers began harvesting by the ton. In 1934 alone, the state produced more than 350,000 tons of thistle hay to feed cattle that no longer had pasture, and families with no other option started doing the same with the plant's young shoots, boiling them like greens or canning them in jars for winter. Journalist Timothy Egan's book, The Worst Hard Time, documents the Lowry family who survived for months largely on canned tumbleweed as their food base. The plant that today is just a decorative symbol in Western movies was, for a real and documented period, the difference between eating and not eating for entire families across Kansas and Oklahoma. And if tumbleweed solved hunger on dry ground, a wild leaf from the south solved it the same way, only it grew on riverbanks instead. Poke salad. Poke salad. In the southern Appalachians, when the season's crop couldn't stretch a family to the next harvest, children were sent down to the riverbanks to gather a plant that, raw, is toxic enough to kill. Poke salad comes from the pokeweed plant, and its young leaves only become safe after being boiled twice in clean water, with the liquid discarded each time. Families from Kentucky to Alabama depended on this plant during the Great Depression as a free and nearly endless food source, usually sautéed in bacon grease with an egg on top. The tradition ran so deep that decades later, commercial canneries were still packing poke salad just to satisfy the nostalgia of people who had migrated from the rural South to California during the hardest years of drought and economic crisis. And while poke salad came free from the riverbank, another Southern survival meal depended on buying exactly 3 ingredients, not one more. The 3M diet cotton workers across the American South during the Great Depression survived on a combination so repetitive it earned its own nickname among food historians. The 3M diet. Meat, meal, and molasses, salt pork, cornmeal turned into bread, and molasses were practically the only things available to families who worked someone else's land and were paid in store credit instead of cash. Food historian Andrew Coe, co-author of A Square Meal, describes this diet as nearly universal among Southern cotton workers of the era, and notes that the extreme repetition led to real cases of malnutrition even when stomachs were technically full every day. It wasn't hunger in the sense of not eating, it was hunger in the sense of eating the same thing endlessly without any of the nutrients the body actually needed. And while the South relied on that fixed combination, rural Texas solved its own scarcity with a plant most people today avoid touching altogether. Prickly pear, nopal. In rural Texas, Mexican-American farm workers had known for generations about a food that most Anglo-American ranchers only started taking seriously during the century's harshest droughts: the prickly pear, or nopal. After burning off the spines over open flame, a technique called chamuscando, the cactus pads could be sliced, cooked, and eaten like an ordinary vegetable, packed with water inland where water was exactly what was missing. During Texas's so-called drought of record between 1950 and 1957, the most severe ever recorded in the state, the nopal stopped being just a food of indigenous and Mexican tradition and became direct sustenance for entire farm-working families, feeding both people and livestock. It's a spine-covered plant that historically fed people long before any farm was ever planted in the region, and kept feeding them when the farm stopped producing. But not every farm solution came from something rooted in the ground. Sometimes it ran straight through the field. Canned jackrabbit. When the 1930s drought wiped out nearly every crop across the Great Plains, one animal multiplied out of control in exactly the place families needed food the most: the jackrabbit. Records from the region confirm that entire families hunted and canned jackrabbit meat as a way to guarantee protein through the hardest months of the Dust Bowl, storing the jars right next to their canned tumbleweed in the same pantry. This wasn't sport hunting or culinary tradition, it was pest control and survival at the same time, since jackrabbits were also destroying what little still tried to grow in backyard gardens. Canning made sure that protein lasted beyond a single dinner, at a time when there was no refrigerator and no guarantee of when the next meat meal would show up. And when there wasn't even a jackrabbit nearby, the solution got even closer to home, literally at the edge of the yard. Wild onions. Wild onions grew freely across fields, forest edges, and roadsides throughout much of rural America. And unlike the family's own crop, nobody had to water them, plant them, or wait months for a harvest. Depression-era families gathered the bulbs and leaves of these onions to bulk out soups, stews, and savory pies, stretching whatever little meat was available with a flavor strong enough to mask how repetitive the menu had become. Period food accounts also highlight the plant's nutritional value, rich in vitamin C, in a diet that often had no other source of that vitamin at all. It was one of the rare foods on this list that required almost no cultivation effort, just the knowledge of where to look and how to recognize the right plant. While onions grew on dry land, another source of free food was waiting literally inside the water: cattail. In the marshes and pond edges that kept surviving even through the worst drought years, one seemingly decorative plant provided food from almost every part of itself. The cattail, with its starchy potato-like rhizome, its young shoots edible like hearts of palm, and its flower spikes that could be cooked like corn, became a documented food source for farm families during the 1930s precisely because it kept growing in wet areas while the crops around it dried up completely. Unlike almost everything else on this list, the cattail required no lengthy boiling process or special preparation against toxins, just gathering, cleaning, and cooking. For a family already spending an entire day's energy trying to save whatever was left of the crop, that simplicity of preparation mattered almost as much as the plant's nutritional value. And if the cattail was forgiving to whoever prepared it, the next plant on this list demanded the opposite: absolute care from the very first touch. Stinging nettle soup. Touching this plant barehanded guaranteed hours of stinging pain, and yet it became one of the most valued foods among rural families during the Great Depression. The stinging nettle, rich in vitamins A and C, iron, potassium, and calcium, completely lost its sting once boiled, and could then be turned into soups, stews, and even fillings, working as a real meat substitute thanks to the leaf's high protein content. Families who knew how to identify and harvest nettle had access to one of the most nutrient-dense foods available for free in any field or fence line, at a time when most rural diets were vitamin poor because of how heavily they relied on cheap carbohydrates. The same care nettle demanded at harvest showed up again in a completely different way in the last piece of thrift on this list. Absolutely nothing could go to waste. Watermelon-rind pickles. When drought split open the watermelon crop before the fruit could properly ripen, or when only the rind was left after every bit of flesh had been eaten, families across the rural South found a way to use every last part of the fruit. The watermelon rind, sliced, salted, and then cooked down in a syrup of vinegar, sugar, and spices, became a pickle that could keep for months in the cellar, turning the leftovers of a bad harvest into a food reserve for the entire winter. It was the kind of recipe passed from mother to daughter precisely because no part of the crop, however small or tough, could be treated as trash on a struggling farm. And the last item on this list took that same logic of total use even further, using not garden leftovers, but the crop's own grain still standing in the field. Parched corn, long before any European-style farm was established in North America. Indigenous communities were already drying and roasting corn kernels over fire to create a light, durable, easy-to-carry food for long journeys, a technique that tenant farm workers adopted directly as a field snack, especially during years of poor harvest, when every single kernel of corn mattered. The dried kernels could be roasted in a dry skillet until crisp, stored in a cloth sack, and carried in a pocket through a full day of field work, with no need for preparation, a plate, or utensils. Unlike almost everything else on this list, parched corn didn't depend on an emergency harvest or a wild plant. It depended only on setting aside a small portion of the very corn already planted before it became feed or got sold. It was, at the same time, the simplest and the oldest food on this entire list, proof that surviving a bad harvest was a deeply American skill long before the Great Depression, even if it's rarely told as history. These 10 foods show that when the harvest failed, hunger wasn't solved with blind desperation. It was solved with accumulated knowledge. What could be eaten by the riverbank, along the roadside, inside the water, or even among the thorns. Surviving land that wouldn't produce meant, above everything else, knowing where else to look. If the harvest failed today, could you actually identify a single one of these 10 foods in your own town? Subscribe now, because the next video reveals more real foods that kept American families standing when the land stopped giving, and the answer might be closer to you than you think. Comment below, which of these 10 would you actually have the nerve to eat first?